recording this program today. So if you have colleagues who will miss it, we will send it to all of our registrants after the program. As a reminder, if you have questions as we're discussing our topics today, please put them in the Q&A. We will address them at the end. Or if you want to raise your hand and ask your question personally, I can allow you to do that at the end of the program. As you saw in the slide, we have some really exciting upcoming programs. I want to mention one in particular. We have a members-only event at Mayweather Boxing. So for those of you who are in town, and it might be new to DC, if you are interested in trying out one of our programs, email me. The first 10 people to email me for the Mayweather Boxing program will be able to attend for free and meet other members. So a really great way to get connected to the public interest community. Speaking of getting connected to the public interest community, in 2 minutes, there will be some information in the chat about how to join. So if you are planning to come back to Washington, DC for employment after graduation, or if you are here in DC going to law school, there are a number of programs that are free for members and or have very small reduced rates. In particular, this summer are a number of law student programs, in particular our Fellowships 101, where we'll be talking about postgraduate fellowships, in our Supreme Court program, where we talk to the journalists who cover the Supreme Court. And that is always an interesting conversation. Our moderator today for today's, one more reminder, and that is any government lawyers who are on our panels are speaking in their individual capacities and not as government lawyers. That is particularly relevant for this program, as our moderator is Brandy Wagstaff, and she is with the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And with that, I will turn it over to Brandy. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to welcome you all here to our program, as well as a warm welcome to all of our panelists. We have some great panelists joining us today, and you should have access to their bios, but we are going to go ahead and start with introductions by each of them, telling us a little bit about their organization and what they do for their organization, and if there are any types of public interest opportunities that students can get involved in within their organization. So that's where we're going to start for today. And I will go ahead and start with Joanne. Joanne?
Thank you, Brandy, and hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Lynn. I am the Executive Director at the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. I am new to this job. I'm in, I think, week 11 on the job, so I am still very much in the newbie phase and with a steep learning curve. The Washington Lawyers Committee is a nonprofit law organization. We are a staff of about 30 people with a budget of about $5.33 million. And we are principally litigators, but we also do public policy, public education, some community organizing. And we work with local communities of color in the Washington, D.C. region on disability, housing, health, education, policing, criminal legal system reform, and immigrant justice issues. We see law students and interns as fellows as vital partners. And we welcome students in the area or during the summer to intern with us in exchange for academic credit. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanne. I'm now going to turn to Erin. Erin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Martin. I'm the Director of Nominations and Cross-Cutting Policies at the National Men's Law Center. The National Men's Law Center was founded just over 50 years ago and fights for gender justice in the courts, in public policy, and in society, working across issues that are central to the lives of women and girls. The Law Center uses the law in all its forms to change culture and drive solutions to the gender inequities that shape our society and break down barriers that harm women and girls, especially those who face multiple forms of discrimination, including women of color, LGBTQ people, and low-income women and families. We work on a broad range of issues from reproductive rights, workplace justice, education, childcare, as well as the courts. So I lead our judicial nominations work and primarily work pre and post nomination to advocate for a fair and impartial and independent judiciary comprised of judges committed to equal justice for all who reflect the rich diversity of our country and also pushing for professional diversity on the bench to increase the number of civil rights lawyers and those with public defense backgrounds on the courts as well. So we also view our legal fellows and our interns as critical partners in our work, and we do engage partners as well at pro bono firms, especially for Supreme Court vacancies and for helping us to vet candidates. We use research from firms as well. For litigation, we often use our pro bono support from firms. We also have a leadership advisory committee of pro bono partners who support our work and help to amplify our work within the legal community. So for example, during last year's Supreme Court confirmation process for Justice Jackson, we had sign-on letters from general counsels across the country, as well as from women lawyers across the country as well. And we offer externships during the academic year for academic credit and paid summer internships during the summer as well. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. Jim, I'm going to turn to you now.
Everyone, my name is Jim Kadima, and right now I'm a free agent. I just wrapped up a stint at Lambda Legal as one of 3 deputy legal directors. So a little bit about Lambda Legal. I'll speak to that entity and a bit about my work there. Lambda's 50-year-old LGBTQ plus legal defense fund. It's modeled after the Pearl Death model out of New York City, which now is known as Latino Justice. And we have Lambda has regional offices in New York, DC, Chicago, Atlanta, LA, and Houston, and takes a very national approach to intervening on high impact cases impacting queer communities. Most of the docket for Lambda has been focused in the last few years on some of the legislative trends that we've seen, including severe attacks on keeping families with a trans or non-binary child together or whole. Odd things out of Florida, including the Don't Say Gay law, which has created a ton of permutations and problems at the local level in schools and now higher education, and attempts to cut off or disrupt trans-affirming healthcare. So that has pretty much been the docket in the last, I would say, 3-4 years for Lambda and for many other queer rights groups. My job at Lambda was to take care of legal operations. So let me quickly walk through that. It's not very sexy. While I sat in the chair to decide which of the many cases with the limited resources that we have we could intervene on. We would do that in partnership with many other organizations. I also had the conundrums that are popping up in modern practice. So the really obscure ethics problems for some of our staff, particularly our trans and non-binary attorneys. We've seen Lambda has seen an unprecedented number of judicial conduct that is baffling, particularly in state courts in very deep red states, where we've seen gag orders, we've seen all sorts of professional conduct and contempt allegations for people doing their job. And also a lot of the general counsel duties that I have seem to kind of go to the extremes of litigation practice. There's a really interesting thing for every institution that is trying to exclude someone who's queer. There is someone queer on staff. So we've seen a tremendous peak in hot documents being sent to us by the mail. If no one remembers that from professional responsibility, or if you haven't had that yet, someone on the other side is sending you things anonymously in the mail. And while that is really nice to have, it could create evidentiary problems when you get to trial, as well as professional conduct issues. So kind of wrapping up that, plus a tremendous peak in identity documents from people asking for legal help, particularly trans folks in crisis. So there's a lot of in-house operations that I had, but this was an incredibly, and it remains incredibly hard time for queer rights. But that in a nutshell is what Lambda does and a little bit of how I fit into the picture.
Jim, before I turn to Tara, does Lambda have opportunities for students during the semester, the summer, or anything like that?
Absolutely. So a couple of things that I want to highlight. Lambda Legal and many other of the queer rights organizations run help desks or helplines. They're not necessarily referral, but they're very tailored on kind of trying to help people do self-representation as well without endorsement, providing names and numbers for local practitioners who may have the skills or the practice of that particular topic. So Lambda Legal, as well as the National Center for Lesbian Rights, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, and GLAD with 1A, so not the media operations organization, but GLAD out of the New England area, all have staffed helplines. So these are places where the layperson can call. Lambda had 5,000 calls per year, and every single one of those are wrapped up with local practitioners, referrals to a bevy. So if you are in a community, it's always good, and you want to pick up pro bono work, low bono work. It's great to kind of make sure that you freshen your contacts with one of the orgs that I just listed. More importantly, like ACLU Lesbian Gays Rights Project, Lambda Legal, and others have robust and dated notions of pro bono. So the big states, the high numerous states, queer destination states, is where there are a lot of law firm partnerships established. But small firms that are boutique, like Relman, other states where there aren't many contacts, red states, those are particular places. If you're at a firm and you have offices in a deep red state, this would be the time to renew and start those contacts with not only Lambda, but any of those other litigating groups. It's really hard to intervene timely in the most obscure place in the country. And we've seen these horrible legislative trends pop up in places that we would expect, but in jurisdictions and local venues that we never would imagine. So kind of this would be the time particularly to refresh those contacts at any of those groups. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. And Tara, last but not least.
Hi, everybody. Tara Ramchandani. I'm a partner at Relman Colfax. We are a private public interest law firm based in DC, but with a nationwide practice. We're a civil rights firm. We do a lot of litigation. We have a litigation practice and then a counseling practice where we'll do advising to nonprofits, financial institutions, and other groups looking to increase their civil rights work and who need advising. So our litigation practice focuses primarily on fair housing and fair lending, although we do employment, we do public accommodations work, we do a lot of disability work. So it's a pretty broad and generalist civil rights practice. We really look at systemic discrimination throughout the country, desegregation, and integrating our communities, whether that is housing, employment, and where you live your life. On our counseling end, we've been working a lot recently on special purpose credit programs and helping financial institutions and federal home loan banks that are looking to roll out special purpose credit programs. We've been advising them on how to do that. We work with a variety of institutions who are trying to increase access to credit throughout the country to different populations. So I am primarily in our litigation space. I am a trial lawyer, do a lot of trials, and I'm also one of 11 partners, so part of our management team. In terms of summer associate and law student opportunities, we have a summer associate program every summer. So we have 3 summer associates who are with us right now, and then we also have a fellowship program. We take 1 to 2 fellows every year coming right out of law school, and they stay with us for 2 years. So that's another thing to look out for. We also love to co-counsel, so gotten to work with many of the orgs and faces on the screen, and it's great to be with you all.
I muted myself. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Tara. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to introduce yourselves. I wanted to next talk to you all about a question that is kind of like looking back and also looking forward. So the last few years, we have seen some like unprecedented changes in the public interest civil rights field, especially, during and post-COVID. There's just been a lot that has happened, especially urgency surrounding racial justice issues, reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ rights. So where do all of you kind of see the public interest or civil rights field heading in the next few years? as a result of kind of the current trends from the past 2 years. And I'll go ahead, Joanne, and start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Brandy. I'm going to actually zoom out a little bit more and talk beyond the last 2 years, because I don't think we can actually meaningfully talk about the most recent 2 years without looking at what's happened since 2016. And just to kind of let folks know, in 2016, I was at the ACLU leading their immigration policy program at the federal level. And I was there for a decade. So I was there from 2007 to 17. And then in 2017, I moved over to Amnesty International USA, where I was there for 5 years. This is prior to my current job. And there, my focus was on international refugee protection, free expression, mass atrocities, addressing those. So I had the benefit of working on both human rights issues on the domestic level as well as the international level. So let's rewind back to 2016. Okay, so the Trump election was a stunner for everybody. That wasn't what anyone had planned for or expected. And so I was at the ACLU at the time, and we had transition plans ready to hand over to a Clinton transition team. So needless to say, all of that, the world turned upside down, and that affected every nonprofit in the justice and equity sector, as well as, anyone in like the private bar litigating on these issues. So then I was leading on immigration at the ACLU. Immigration was Donald Trump's #1 issue. That is what he woke up to every morning at 4:30. That is what he would tweet, rant, and rave on. And he was tireless on this. So this continued not only through his campaign, but through every day of his presidency and then some. All of that led up to 2020, the global pandemic, which turned everything again upside down, inside out for all of us in terms of life, community, practice, et cetera. And Biden's election in 2020, the insurrection in early 2021, and now Biden's presidency, which is about, I would say, just about 2 years old now, a little over, I think is returning us to some sense of normalcy. But I will say, even at the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, we don't feel like we've had a regular normal year. 2023 may be our first average normal year. I'm using those words very loosely. And I mean that in terms of our litigation, but also our fundraising, the demands on us. We don't know if this is like kind of what the new normal is going to be, or if we're just still kind of in an in-between period. I will just say for a moment that obviously, in the killing of George Floyd, the national reckoning on racial justice, which everyone said was going to happen, which has happened in some ways and yet has not happened at all, where we have had no major systemic reform at the national level that is anywhere close to what is needed. That leaves us in a very difficult place with our clients, our communities, our partners. At the same time, we have to be prepared for a 2024 presidential election that could bring in a different person into the White House with a very different agenda. And I think we've all learned from the prior presidency that we always have to be ready for the worst case scenario. And we have to be planning today for that. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring this conversation to such a doomsday place, but as a leader of a civil rights and human rights organization, one of the things I try to do is be very real with my colleagues and my partners. I try to be very real about what I know, what I don't know, what I'm guessing. I am also a big fan of making sure that each individual person is being taken care of and that they each can do what they need to do to really get through the days and also to ultimately to succeed and to thrive. I will say the one piece of good news that is hit, I won't say across the board, but certainly in some of the sectors that we work in that are represented on this Zoom call, is there has been a boost in revenue with some big philanthropists and some corporations giving, especially certainly in the wake of the Floyd killing. But it remains to be seen whether that kind of support is going to be short-lived or sustained. And that, of course, affects our ability to plan as program leaders. So I'll turn it back to you, Brandy.
No, thank you. Thank you, Joanne. Tara, I'm gonna turn to you next because you also kind of see from your point of view at Relman, where you're working on so many different cross-cutting issues, kind of what are some of the new emerging trends or urgent issues that we are going to be facing in the next few years, and that students coming out of law school are going to be facing that want to get into these types of areas of law.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of the lessons that civil rights advocates had to learn over and over again is that progress is not linear, right? We are not moving in one direction in terms of, making sure that everybody is, everybody living in this country is set up to thrive and have the protections of our civil rights laws. And so I think we often see sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes more than 1 step back. And one of the things that we have noticed in our practice, and I think that we don't quite yet know what the total fallout is going to be, and this is echoing some of the things that Joanne said, but the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think we're coming out of it, but we are still very much living with COVID and the effects of COVID and what that has done to our most marginalized communities. And so, we are starting to see again, I mean, we have, I think probably 5 right now, redlining investigations, right? So you're looking at banks who are not providing credit to communities of color. And I think for a long time in the early aughts, we were seeing more reverse redlining, right? So banks were targeting communities of color for predatory products. And of course, we all saw the fallout of that in 2008 in the financial crisis. But I think we're seeing once again, many banks who, as they restricted, when we were facing a much more difficult financial climate, stopped lending to communities of color. So we have a bunch of investigations going there and, are bringing those cases again. And so I think in part it is keeping our eyes open for things that no problem is solved, right? I have a case right now that it's a disparate impact case. We're in the Second Circuit. I think that probably we'll get a good opinion on the Second Circuit, and then there are going to be big questions, right? Because this is a Supreme Court that is looking, sorry to say this, and precedent doesn't seem to matter in the same way. We'll see, what comes down in the next few days and week. And so I think that is thinking about what kinds of big questions we're pushing, and frankly, being maybe a little bit more careful about the cases we bring, and having to make some compromises because there are issues that you don't necessarily want going up to the Supreme Court right now. And so, sometimes you have to make those compromises. I think we're also seeing a lot of work now on appraisals. And I think this is a space actually where I think there is a lot of optimism, right? Which is that the Biden administration has been really focused on looking at discrimination in appraisals. And I think there's an openness to reforming the way that we do appraisals in this country. What are the standard practices and accepted business practices around appraisals, FICO scores, et cetera, and expanding access to credit and home ownership. And so that's a space that we're also working on. And I think there's movement to push there, which is really exciting.
Excellent. Thank you. And Erin, I wanted to turn to you next. At the National Women's Law Center, what are you all seeing as some of the more urgent or emerging issues right now? And then I have a second part of my question for you. How do you see our fields more effectively incorporating intersectionality in our work? So, you have a focus at the National Women's Law Center on, women and girls and issues like that. But also I'm sure that there's a lot of intersectionality work that is incorporated into that. And if you can kind of talk about some of those urgent or emerging issues and the way that we can more effectively work on the intersectionality that seems to be, cross-cutting all of the civil rights public interest field.
Sure. So I think that right now what we're emerging towards is democracy reform, kind of at a broader level at the state and national level. I think for many of us, the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the ways in which our government isn't working for all of us and is really leaving the most vulnerable people at risk for a lot of health issues. And with the overturning of Roe last year, we saw the Supreme Court take away a constitutional right for the first time ever. So I think we're still grappling with the after effects of both of those, and kind of there's a desire to move towards a society in which we see ourselves reflected, where we have elected leaders who are actually championing our rights, and where we have a system and a constitution that we can believe in. And we're seeing right now, especially among the various issue areas from reproductive rights, racial justice, LGBTQI, which impacts people regardless of their race and ethnicity, different socioeconomic status as well, is a connecting of the dots in the ways in which those issues are impacting people's lives across the country, especially in the Deep South and in the Midwest, where we see a lot of threats to those rights being taken by extreme legislators. So what we're seeing is that advocates at the national and state level are coming together a bit more to coalesce around the vision that they see. And we are also seeing organizers organizing around this and really pushing for candidates who they want to see elected, who they know will actually represent their interests and advocate for their rights as well. And I think we're definitely going to continue to see, I think in part of this democracy reform is going to be the reform of our court system as well, to have increased transparency, to actually hold our Supreme Court accountable and our federal courts accountable as well, because the court is going to continue to make more decisions over the next, 10 plus years with this current makeup that are going to continue to impact the way in which we live our lives. And I think that with all of the recent threats and the big shifts that we've seen over the last few years, it's really brought that to the forefront for a lot of people to see the interconnectedness. And that's something the Law Center is really doing with our broader democracy work, is making sure people see where we're seeing the voting rights restrictions is also where we're seeing the restrictions to reproductive rights access as well. And I think tying those threads together has really been helping to engage people to make informed decisions at the polls, and also as they're communicating with their representatives as well.
And that's such a great point, democracy reform and focusing more at the local level, seems like something that we have as civil rights lawyers and public interest lawyers maybe have been remiss in the past. So it's great to hear that, we have to kind of put some urgency and focus on that for sure. Jim, I wanted to talk to you next about just the very urgency that's surrounding the attack on trans individuals and the trans community across this country, especially in the forms of the introduction of legislation that is just popping up in so many red states. And we've had, just in this past week, we've had a good court victory that's given us some hope. But what do you think that people who are interested, law students, new lawyers who are interested in focusing in these areas and working in that space could be doing right now, forward looking, in terms of the types of work or organizations or, any kind of grassroots efforts that they could be doing at this point?
Sure. I think a lot of what is unstated with this legislative trend, while it is daunting, while it is growing, is there is a political crassness to it. For one of the major political parties, one of the few policy platforms that they have that gets them attention at the movable middle seems to be erasing trans and non-binary individuals from every domain of life. To the extent that gambit, so to the extent that Joanne mentioned all of the heavy work around immigration, To the extent a non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals are the new easy target, this could have legs. So I think a couple of things are percolating under the surface that is worth every law student, every advocate and ally for queer rights to really think about. We are going to have to roll back the clock to some strategies from the 90s. As I was in the law school in the late 90s, some of the lawyering skills and some of the lawyering endeavors were very different on the road to marriage and after marriage. So a lot of your queer rights institutions have some really tough questions, right? We can have small victories here, there, possibly going up to an appellate circuit, but we have to have hard discussions with our clients that we may not be going all the way up. To the extent Clarence Thomas's concurrence in the downfall in the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade is a sign of what's to come. All of the history and the legal strategy that the queer rights bench has done for decades has been around substantive due process. If we are in the final stretches of substantive due process, we then are forced with the tough question about equal protection. And there's only one major case in queer rights, Romer versus Evans, I believe from the early 2000s, where you cannot make queer people forever strangers to systems of government. So there's some really tough questions of what theories to bring, how far to bring them. That brings me back to the scholarship for many queer professors from the 90s, Nan Hunter, Nancy Polikoff, Hy Feldblum. It all seems like quaint and dated, but their articulation of how to define high impact, how to lawyer for queer populations is less about climbing that appellate ladder and focusing on the legal protections, particularly common law instruments, contracting, things in family law that are really important to protecting your chosen family. So I think there's a lot of returning to less sexy work. Really, I mean, this is really exciting for like the folks that aren't constitutional lawyers, but the transactional work around assisted reproduction, family protections, documents to visit your loved one in the hospital, healthcare proxies, wills, trusts, all of those mechanisms become really important backstops at the individual level. So the conception of high impact has to shift. It's got to be high impact for the individual in the worst of times. Plus, not only like bad fashion, we're back to the 90s, we've got some new problems. So we have to look forward as well too. No one ever contemplated, our opponents on the other side of these debates got really creative with bounty hunter laws. Those become nearly impossible to use judicial intervention, injunctions. It becomes really tough questions of standing. And so to really think through some of what the National Women's Law Center of, if there are bounty hunter provisions, one parent can ban a book, how do we break that system by making sure that people who on the opposite side are equally entering? There's a novel case that banned the Bible based on its sex context under these standards. So there's this really interesting opportunity through the legislative process or administrative process for one individual with the backing of attorneys and local communities to stress some of these bounty. One person can bring an entire governmental apparatus to a screeching halt. Or so what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So there's some political strategies we should look at. So legislative lawyering, regulatory, canons of construction, a lot, and creative con law. This is the time to really think about things like the contracts clause, right? We've all passed over that in con law, but so deep attention to other instruments that are not substantive due process or equal protection to be drivers of thoughtful, creative strategies. So there's a bit of the old and new that is ahead of us. And so kind of really thinking through as a law student to not only take like the advised courses for bar prep or to have economic prospects on the market, but some of those obscure skills-based classes and seminars that really get to these obscure topics or ways to engage hard to reach populations, those at the margins and shadows, become incredibly important skills to have early in your career if we are to see this continue.
Thank you, Jim. So it sounds like, just from listening to all of you, a couple of, things that seem to be emerging as themes is, get involved at the local level. Start thinking about ways you can help on the individual level as opposed to broader impact litigation. Maybe we're trying to avoid, cases working their way up to the Supreme Court at this time. What can we do locally, both from democracy perspectives and individual perspectives? And getting creative, and getting creative might mean looking back at strategies we've used in the past, which makes sense since, we seem to be rolling back some of our laws and our rights that we had taken for granted up until now. So that definitely all sounds like really, important things for law students, new lawyers to be thinking about that want to make an impact in this area. Now, one of the other things that, I heard listening to all of you is the fact that, despite the broad consensus in our society that like COVID's over, that there has been long-term impacts on marginalized communities with COVID, especially health impacts. And one of the things that we haven't really talked about in any great detail from any of you, so I appreciate anyone who wants to chime in here, is what are we doing in the area, or what are we needing to do in the area of disability rights, especially as more and more people become disabled due to the impacts of COVID on our long-term health. So many people suffering from long COVID symptoms, becoming disabled, dealing with new and chronic health issues that are impacting their ability to continue working, continue supporting their families and themselves. So any of you would like to chime in on kind of thoughts that you have in that area and what we can be doing there?
One thing I'll just quickly chime in about is it really highlighted the need for paid leave, for paid medical and family leave. So that way people are able to take care of their caregiving responsibilities if they do have a family member who requires special needs or special assistance or care following COVID-19. I think also with childcare needs, I think it really amplified that for COVID-19 as we adjusted to some people having to work remotely, or schools adjusting to having school, I almost said working remotely, but having schools remotely as well. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic really amplified that, but I think the need for paid leave is very central and at the forefront to actually have leave so people can take time off of work when they are not feeling well, and not fall into poverty or below, or have their lives put at risk, or their well-being put at risk if they're unable to work. So I would definitely say paid leave for that.
Absolutely.
The other thing I would add to that is just making sure that when we talk about disability, we are also talking about mental health disabilities. I think it is very easy. When people can see a disability, they react differently, right? So it's easy to say, okay, if somebody's in a wheelchair, they need a ramp to be able to get into a building. Doesn't always happen. In fact, many times it doesn't. But it's a disability that I think is often easier for the courts and general public to understand. But 1 in 4 people in this country at any given time is grappling with a mental health disability. And so I think just shining a light on the fact that mental health is equally important to being able to access society and to be able to participate fully, and that it is protected under our civil rights laws.
Yeah, and we know that there has been some significant impacts on mental health just from the last several years, especially through COVID and stuff. Jim?
Yeah, I can think of some older but under-tapped resources that exist within the disability rights world. For a lot of, as a person with a non-apparent disability, for a lot of people with disability, advocacy is done in various silos. The blind, the deaf, and even within that, there are divisions within each of those kind of clusters. There are very few intentional spaces for cross-disability advocacy. And so to strengthen and invest in those, particularly as a law student, particularly as a lawyer, I think there's some untapped potential. Oddly enough, in the disability rights space, there is a robust federal funding stream through the Health and Human Services statutes that create centers for independent living that are very regional around the country, as well as Protection and Advocacy Network. Many of them over the years have really taken a non-legal focus. Some, however, have a very ambitious docket. And while they go after institutionalized care and some really egregious issues, this is one of the few spaces where cross-disability people seek services. So strengthening, making these sort of run local legal aid with federal funding, who are free to sue governments, is a rare thing, is really to look about their unique investigatory powers to uncover some egregious things in unusual places, and to really show a cross-disability perspective. And the pandemic has forced us into these Zoom environments. And we all need to adopt universal design principles. We really need to be intentional about our content as providing legal education, legal awareness, legal tools. Whatever we are doing that is broadcast to the public, we've got to activate all of those little boxes. So where closed captioning is by default, not perfect, but the AI that does closed captioning. We have to think about all of those tools that help people with disabilities and others who use an open marketplace of apps and tools to engage with content. And so we have to redo all of our websites. Federal government has done a good job of holding large institutions accountable, but some of our institutions, we provide critical services at critical times. So we really need to think about accessibility and going above a WCAG or an ADA standard and really thinking about universal design. If a curb cut can help someone who uses a wheelchair, it's also going to help someone with a stroller or someone with a cane. So we really need to envision our electronic spaces in a way that we are reaching everyone with disabilities, particularly intersectionally. So people of color with disabilities, queers with disabilities, et cetera, and our non-immediate image of what might be a disability need. So that's a robust canon of law, but we need to meet the moment so we can bridge and find those clients.
Yeah, and you make a great point about universal design. I mean, if as a society we can understand that building things accessible not just benefits people with disabilities and people who will have disabilities in the future, because almost, that can happen to any of us at any point in our lives. But it's going to benefit society as a whole with universal design. So that's absolutely true. And just, what Tara mentioned, what you mentioned, there's just so many invisible disabilities, some things that aren't obvious upon looking at someone. And we are in such an ableist society. So it's important to open our eyes to that and understanding so much more about invisible disabilities as well, and kind of helping with those cross-cutting issues, because disability impacts so many areas of life. It's not a single area of life. I worked in disability rights for 7 years. So it's just like, there's not a single portion of life that disability doesn't impact. So it's probably one of the most cross-sectional civil rights areas of law that I know about. Joanne?
Just jump in and just add to this already very rich, robust discussion, but in terms of both intersectionality and thematic. I mean, at Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, our program areas, every single one of them is touched by disability, whether it's housing justice, immigrant justice, policing, education, the criminal legal system. I wanted to also mention, since I know we have, some students, interns and fellows on our call today, that there's tremendous need to be educating and advising institutions of higher education. And that students, as citizens of their own universities and colleges, may be well poised to do that. So, for instance, at the Washington Lawyers Committee, we have brought litigation against American University, a private university here in Washington, D.C. We've also sued the D.C. public school system, the Bureau of Prisons, which has jurisdiction over older teens needing special education who are in criminal custody. In all of these cases, whether it's failing to provide special education that has been documented based on educational disability, or sometimes it is the way law enforcement or campus police are responding to situations that really cry out for mental health services and treatment, but sometimes result in people being involuntarily committed. And that definitely tracks along race lines. These are some of the issues that we run into, every day, every week. And so I completely agree that the disability is the through line that goes through all of our practice areas.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want us to, since we're about at 12:47 right now, I wanted to start opening it up to questions from our attendees, and feel free to type your questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. I already have a question that I'm going to start with. One of our attendees asked, do you foresee the restorative justice and reparations legal field being legitimized in the United States?
Okay, I'll take that one.
Okay.
The question. And the reason I'm gladly embracing it is just on this past Thursday, I testified before the DC City Council about DC reparations. And this is the first time in the history of the District of Columbia that they've had a public hearing on reparations. Just a quick historical primer on DC, which even for me, as someone who works in this field and lives in this field, I'm still constantly learning. The actual lands that were used to create the District of Columbia were annexed from Potomac slave plantations several hundred years ago. The White House, the US Capitol, were built by enslaved Africans whose owners were paid for their forced labor. In 1862, when then President Abraham Lincoln emancipated slaves in the DC territory, he authorized reparations to the owners of those slaves in exchange for emancipation. So the history of reparations is we're lawyers, right? So to the extent that we believe in precedent, it is well established both historically and legally here in the District of Columbia. It's just that the reparations went to the wrong people. Now, fast forward to 2022, 2023, we have now seen reparations policies enacted in cities like San Francisco, Evanston, Illinois. The state of California has seriously undertaken this issue, extensively studying reparations proposals, coming up with different valuation schemes for considering a statewide reparations program. So I as somebody who a few years ago, I would have said, okay, never ever, not because I didn't believe in it, but I just thought never ever is it going to happen, and it's not worth spending your time and energy there because never ever. Now I think it should be front and center. And I think it's a legal, historical, economic, moral imperative. And I think that the District of Columbia may be the first jurisdiction to seriously consider reparations that is a former slave market jurisdiction. So we have a particularly important role to play. And for those of you who live here or who attend school here, there's a tremendous opportunity to influence this moment. And whether it's your local city council member, any contacts you have with the mayor, or other people in city government, I would be happy to talk offline with anybody about this. So the answer is yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanne. Erin?
Sure. I think I think it's interesting, and I'm glad that you made that point, Joanne, about it being a former slave territory, just because I think that for reparations, we're seeing it. I think it's reparations for what? I think is the question too, because if you're talking about where people were enslaved, and then it's a matter of whether or not it's going more broadly to broader Black community or to those who are descendants of the enslaved Africans. And I think that that's kind of something that hasn't been studied as much. So I know that there is a federal bill to that extent that would look at that for mapping at the federal level. But I think that you kind of have to look at who the reparations are for, and what is being used to implement it. I know that Georgetown, for example, has something around reparations in the form of a student fee. But I think there's also questions around who's being charge those fees. And I think around the various proposals too, for whether or not there's an additional tax to pay for reparations, and what it would feel like for a Black person who is a descendant of enslaved Africans to have to pay a tax towards getting reparations. I think it's also an interesting point, but it is nice to see that it is an emerging field that folks are discussing and looking at studying more broadly as well. But I think that there's a lot of questions around it that still have to be fleshed out a bit before we hopefully would see the 40 acres and a mule that the descendants of enslaved Africans were promised. Yeah, thank you.
And I think the big part of that, Erin, is messaging around reparations to the general public, because it does seem to be a lot of resistance to it from the general public. And how can we explain and message the importance of and the need for reparations generally, to make it more palatable for those that would oppose it. Jim, you had a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to take up the restorative justice component of the question. In a prior life, I was a U.S. Department of Education official at the Office for Civil Rights. And we were very appreciative and cognizant of the investment restorative justice models have been taking in many school districts across the country. It is becoming much more of a normative way to resolve infractions, alleged infractions, interpersonal disputes. It's a diversion. It's a very worthwhile exploring diversion into high stakes judicial proceedings, whether it be discipline in schools, the criminal justice system, et cetera. But at Lambda, we noticed that our first generation of those who take restorative justice as normative, as should be part of a broad spectrum of approaches, entered our workforce. So there is a brewing trend, particularly at national legal organizations. There's also a trend of unionization. So from a practical, whether you believe in restorative justice or you know the dollar figure that every unionized grievance costs management, we explored and instituted restorative justice practices as sort of a way to really get at the ability for people to be heard, and particularly for those who've done them wrong to voluntary, it's not coercive, but it adds into a spectrum of choices. So restorative justice in the workplace is a brewing topic, which more and more, I would guess, we will see. And I want to go back to wellness. Another brewing trend that is really important is suicide ideation in queer communities has been a persistent issue. Being kicked out of your family, kicked out of your community, disowned, disinherited. It can really be shaping of queer and questioning people's lives. So one thing at Lambda that is being piloted right now is a disenrollment program with the onslaught of anti-trans, anti-non-binary in every facet of life. For many of my colleagues who are not cisgendered, this is a really tough time. And so for many people, they're doubling down. This is why they went to law school and this is what they're here for. For some people, this is a time when it's just too much. And so we have been, Lambda has piloted a way for people to take a break, to step away from the moment, from the weight, and focus on wellness. So I think part of a restorative practice is not just between the individuals, but recognizing the mental wellness and the work-life balance for the individuals in the trenches. So contemplating, there's a brewing trend of disenrollment, although it's more than a sabbatical. There's no guarantee you'll come back, which is okay, in messaging that to give people agency back in a time when people are trying to be erased off of life's map. So just wanted to point out that there's other brewing things that law students, it's a great time to research them and really speak to them both as a practical and jurisprudential, these models of where they fit in.
Thank you, Jim. And I actually have a question for you from one of our audience members. They asked, while legal victories are obviously critical, what do you, Jim, think is the best way to combat anti-trans and anti-queer hate on the ground among our communities? How can we work to challenge the normalized idea that trans identity is even up for debate?
Okay, speaking as Jim, I think the most important thing to recognize is the legislative environment we're in. And the animus that is just not hidden and there behind all of this really prompt some tough questions for people who are the target of this brewing legal trend. I go back to all of my immigrant rights advocacy. There's no guarantee people will get a demotion. There's no guarantee of a protective order. There's no guarantee that people will not be doxxed and threatened electronically or physically in local community. So a well-rounded approach to taking care of your client, your prospective client, is empowering them not to go to court as well too. And so for me, the most impactful way to help people in this moment are to give them the choice to engage in their right to travel, whether that's picking up and moving to a safer jurisdiction. Destination cities, destination states have always been part of queer life. There's a reason San Francisco was a destination place. DC, being one of the early adopters of queer rights, has been a destination place. But for people that are in hostile territories that they find themselves in, it's really counseling them. So really working through individual relief, name change options, ID clinics, really sitting with someone and working through how to respect their identity, prepare them for a new life. And it's not, this is hard work because not everyone is portable and that comes with consequences. So really thinking through that individual transaction as part of a larger effort. So right now, some of the most important things where people can spend their time are local ID clinics. Law schools have them, major corporate employers have them. Microsoft, through their pro bono efforts, are using technology to get ID clinics off the ground. So there is a way to do that brief prospective client, really present the range of options where you're not having prolonged attorney client. I think those type of things really meet the moment, despite all the difficulties in the long stretch that is high impact litigation. It's not for everyone. But I think the most impactful thing, the team that I just supervised, was that meeting that need of really to make a wise, informed decision of where to move and protect people through contracting and family law. How to move in a way where your gender and name, dead name, are no longer part of your official records is really requires some intentionality that mostly people can't do on their own. So I think those sort of individual transactions have to be part of high impact and are the most important things we can do now, regardless of whether this legislative trend is on the books for a long time or not.
Thank you, Jim. Christina, do we have any live questions from the audience? Anyone? I want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions from people, from the attendees that might want to ask verbally.
Yeah, of course. I actually have been asking folks to put their questions in the Q&A. So thank you all for doing that so that we can all see them and see what the answers are. One question that I get from every audience for the panel, and so I'll just pose that now. What can law students about to graduate do right this minute in this area? And and sort of more specifically, what are the organizations? Is it a law firm? Is it a nonprofit? Is it government? Is it a policy organization? Kind of where are the places where you can go? I know the answer is everything, but I would love to hear from all of you.
Erin.
Oh, I'd love to go because I know I have to jump in a second. I definitely would recommend applying for fellowships at the National Women's Law Center. Also fellowships. I'm sure a lot of nonprofits do as well through the SCADN program, Equal Justice Works, and also internal fellowships that are offered as well. We have a reproductive justice one, for example, that's internally funded. And I think also if you choose to go into private practice in big law or at smaller firms, is just doing pro bono to the extent that you can, and also volunteering. DC has an extensive pro bono center as well, in which you can volunteer throughout the DC area and helping small businesses or helping people with individual issues that may arise. And I think when you're able to do that, you're really able to build a knowledge base and develop your skills. And I think that'll help you whether or not you decide to stay in private practice or if you do decide to transition to a nonprofit later on. I also think it's important to continue reading up and staying engaged in the cases in the particular fields that you're interested in. SCOTUS blog is one of my favorite blogs that I listen to. I'm not a podcast person. I know a lot of people do listen to podcasts as well for those. And I think that's another great way to kind of very, very much stay up to date on just kind of the legal issues that are emerging. And also follow the people that whose careers you're very interested in following. I'm happy to do coffee dates or lunch dates with folks too. I'm going to drop my email and then chat again. So feel free to email me if you do have any questions or follow up. I'd be happy to chat about my career or any questions that you may have too. But it was a pleasure joining the panel. I'm sorry I have to hop about 10 minutes early, but I'll drop my info in the chat. And thank you all.
Thank you, Erin, so much, and for those great recommendations too. Jim?
I just wanted to get creative for a moment. Yes, there's a lot of formal things law students and graduating law students should apply and really think about. Split summers is a good mechanism to really kind of peek behind the curtain. While you're at a firm, you have a tremendous amount of weeks off. Half of that could be at a firm, and then another later under-resourced time for legal aid and legal nonprofits is going to be that second half of the summer. There are ways to kind of get your foot in the door and really see what the work is about. But I would put out crowdsourcing, and I would put out membership. These are two unusual techniques that become really important in this new era that we're at with bounty hunter laws and with people that are tremendously in crisis and may not be able to lend their name to litigation. So let me talk about crowdsourcing. There are a small set of experts that always make awful arguments. It takes a lot of resources to challenge those experts on the stand. And so to crowdsource the tracking of these limited hostile experts or alleged experts, to find every impeachable statement, every contradiction, if queer student law groups could take the lead with their unlimited research, Westlaw and Lexis, and other research skills, it'd be really good if we could collectively mobilize. This is Jim speaking. I have no affinity to any brand, Coke or Pepsi, but that requires a lot of resources and is really important work, is kind of identifying the opponents on the other side, their small cast of characters, I emphasize characters, and really tracking what they say and do in everything in their professional capacities becomes really important. I'm not asking folks to dox them. I'm asking people to keep track of what they say professionally on the stand, in authorship, etc. They're incredibly, it's important for movements to be able to impeach them and make sure that they're not deemed experts, or really have juries understand that they're not experts. So that is sort of a weird sort of crowdsourcing space. The other is, this is the time to be a member, even though it's not your affinity group. Elder American groups like SAGE in the queer community, GLSEN, PFLAG, it's a nominal membership fee, but standing through those entities becomes really important when a family is not willing to come forward or an elder is not yet fully out. So really think through unusual affinity groups within the cause that you really believe in, and pay those memberships, because you might be the member that might be pled to be part of a class or organizational standing. So really think about unusual membership fees. They're nominal, hopefully affordable. I know what it was like to be a law student. It's worse now, but it's a few coffees may allow you, who has legal capacity and learning, to really stand in and bring in a lot of the strategy around the Texas thing going after families with trans youth. Really resolved itself early on for protection for members of PFLAG. So there was a rush for people to sign up to become members of PFLAG. So think about creative memberships, might be a useful tool in assisting litigation strategies.
The only thing I wanted to add to that I think is important for people to think about. I mean, I know we're here in Washington, D.C., which is the site of the nation's capital, but I really think the opportunities for gain, for positive action, are at the local level and sometimes at the state level. And so that could be the locality where you're going to school or where you grew up, or it could be a new place. But even what I mentioned before about those jurisdictions that are moving forward on reparations proposals, you will notice that the US government and Congress are not listed there. It's at local levels, even though we all recognize that the real big reparations has to come at the national level, involving the national government. The other thing I just wanted to mention is, I know that we're all joined by a training in the law and a dedication to the law, but if you want to actually help contribute or help promote an equity or justice issue or community, it doesn't have to be through your formal profession. And so, for instance, after the fall of Kabul in August 2021, I started working very closely with congregations, faith communities here in the Washington, D.C. region that were eager to sponsor Afghan families to help them resettle and start their lives anew in the United States. And truthfully, this is an area that the Biden administration had totally botched and fallen down on. There was no humanitarian response planned to meet the need. And so a lot of the work that I've done with these congregations isn't legal per se, but honestly helping to set them up in apartments, getting their kids enrolled in school, getting them job training, getting them jobs, linking them to a volunteer asylum lawyer. All of that, if that all happens, it means that there won't be as much litigation that needs to get done for this group. And that's good news, because the legal options on many of these issues, and at least in the migration area, that's not where we're going to win. And that's not going to bring immediate relief to those families that are in distress.
Tara?
Yeah. So Joanne said exactly what I was going to say about, looking outside of sort of the major metropolitan areas. I think it's wonderful that you all are here in DC. I love living in DC, but I spent my first law school summer in Jackson, Mississippi, working for a solo civil rights and criminal justice practitioner, and it was amazing. And so I think, to the extent you can get into these communities, there are so many opportunities. There's so much important work that needs to happen, and just broadening kind of the places that you're willing to go is incredibly important. The other thing I'll say is that, so I actually spent my first year after law school at Goodwin Procter. I spent 10 months at a big law firm before I went to clerk, and then came to Relman. And I spent that year living as though I was making a public interest salary. And it was a piece of advice I got from a public interest lawyer while I was in law school. And it was so important. So we put the vast majority of my salary towards loans. And it allowed me to come out of that job and into civil rights work, just feeling a little less nervous about our, sort of financial situation. So it's very easy when you are working big law hours and surrounded by people who are planning for that income for the next, 5 years, 10 years, to start spending money in those patterns. And I think if you budget as though you are going to make the salary of the job that you want, makes it a lot easier to get the job that you want.
Great recommendations from all of you. Great out-of-the-box thinking. Definitely hearing a theme for law students to be focusing at the local levels, focusing on your communities, doing what work you can there as well. And, for those of you that do have to go into private practice for financial reasons, Tara, that was a great recommendation. Live like you're on a public interest salary, save as much as you can. I know that a lot of law firms also have pro bono opportunities that you should definitely take advantage of if that is the work that you want to be doing. But yes, great recommendations all around. Unless there are any more questions, Christina?
There are not. That was such great advice. Thank you, Brandy, for leading us through a fantastic discussion. Jim, Tara, Joanne, and Aaron, you guys are amazing. As a reminder, I will be adding their contact information in the follow-up email, so you'll be able to contact them if you want to follow up. Regardless of where you go after graduation, you can make a difference. Even if it's one person, one case, one pro bono case, or you decide to work at a systemic level, or anything in between, there are certainly areas of the law, and this is one of them, civil rights and civil liberties, where all of us count. We need all hands to the wheel. And there are ways, even in the big law firms, where you think, I have no time in my life. The law firms, especially here in DC, are so supportive of pro bono and will make it possible. So I appreciate all of you so very much. We are going to take about a 4 or 5 minute break, and then we will come back to our immigration and human rights panel, which is going to, this first panel was just an appetizer for that panel. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.